right, the next topic is expounding on expansion. Getting back to the whole combustion process, we ignite the fuel, short version. It generates heat, and then the heat acts on the nitrogen in the air. And as that air gets hotter, it wants to expand. And if it cannot expand, it starts building pressure. That pushes down on the piston. Different gases expand at different rates based on the same amount of heat input. So some gases, like argon, a little bit of heat and they just fall whoosh. But argon's not a real practical gas to be using in an engine. What do we have at our disposal? Obviously the nitrogen in the air. But if we take a look at the byproducts of combustion, we have 18% water vapor, 15% carbon dioxide. Well, how do those gases compare to nitrogen? Actually, water vapor will expand. I heard this number, and I'm not able to validate it, but I heard that water will expand 12 times with the same amount of heat input for every one time a nitrogen will. So if you had like a container of nitrogen and a container of water vapor and put the same amount of thermal BTU heat into both, the water vapor will create 12 times the pressure that the nitrogen will. I can't validate that number, but I've been easily able to validate water certainly expands a whole lot more for the same heat input as opposed to nitrogen. That is your expansion medium. And we can actually soup that up. So the whole concept of exhaust gas recirculation, most of us are familiar with that because back in the 1970s, EPA mandated reduction in NOx in the exhaust gases. So what did the car companies do? Set up several different teams. I want you to figure out what to do to reduce NOx emissions. I want you to figure out what to do to reduce NOx emissions. I want you to figure... And then this guy came back and he said, well, boss, we found that if we recycle exhaust gases back into the intake charge, that they burn slower. And that reduces peak cylinder temperatures. And NOx goes down. Good job, good job. And you? Well, boss, we found that if we retard ignition timing, that it reduces peak cylinder pressures and NOx goes down. Awesome work, man. And what did you find? Well, we found that if we reduce the compression ratio, that NOx goes down because peak cylinder temperatures go down. Great, we'll use them all. Let's look at what George Arlington Moore did. Remember, he's the guy that kind of invented the Atkins cycle. George Arlington Moore found a way of using EGR to improve performance and improve fuel economy in addition to reducing exhaust emissions. But he didn't do it the way the OEMs did back in the 70s. Whereas the car companies were reducing compression, George thought to himself, well, if we have a slower burn, we could get more expansion ratio by increasing the compression. And slower burns less likely to detonate. So he would jack up the compression ratio. And you know what? Since it's a slower burn, we could crank up the ignition timing and get our critical crank angle advantage back. And he cranked up the ignition time. In other words, the only thing in common between what George and the OEMs did is recycle the exhaust gases back through. From there, they did opposites. So the exhaust gas has the water vapor and the carbon dioxide, which are like souped up expansion medium compared to the nitrogen that is being ingested through the ambient air. But then again, George would compensate with higher compression and more ignition timing. Now in today's automobiles, a lot of them already have EGR. If not, it's kind of hard to retrofit an EGR system. It's not an easy bolt-on. Unless your particular version did not come with it, but the same engine from a different model year or something did, then it might be doable. Is there something else you can do? Well, we did mention water vapor, water injection. Now, when it comes to water injection, there's basically two ways of administering it. One is you spray liquid droplets in. Frozen Boost is a company that makes a water injection system for like turbo applications. And it sprays water, atomized water, into the air intake charge. Now, if you've got a turbo system, you're getting incredible cylinder pressures and temperatures. And tiny little water droplets, as they evaporate, they absorb some of that heat. So, A, they're phase changing, they're creating pressure in their own right, but they're also absorbing that heat energy that would normally grenade the engine. So now you can run higher boost. In fact, the turbo guys like to call water injection a liquid intercooler. That's great for performance. But the problem with fuel economy, if you tried something like that to improve fuel economy, is that evaporating those little droplets absorb so much of the thermal energy that you don't really get the pressure gain. And what happens is you're burning gas as a water vaporizer. So you wind up losing fuel efficiency. But if you could get water vapor into the intake charge, water vapor isn't going to absorb all that much energy to try to vaporize. It's just going to expand with the water or with the energy. It gets hot, it expands, pushes harder than the nitrogen did. So a water vapor system, now you can push harder on the piston, get better fuel economy, and actually reduce NOx emissions. But it does, just like EGR, it does slow down the flame propagation rate. And going back to the earlier discussion where we were trying to get as much of that conversion stuff happening within that magic window, water injection and EGR kind of fight against it. So on one hand, you're getting a more powerful expansion medium, but on the other hand, your magic window thing gets messed with. So how can we counteract that? Well, we can use a combustion accelerant. Now, there's stuff you can put in your gas tank when you fill up that will allegedly speed up the burn. I cannot recommend any. I don't know offhand. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm sure they do. I know they do. I just don't know a brand. But there's something called ozone. Now, in the ignition system, we said, if you got a distributor cap, use brass terminals. Well, this is a used distributor cap, and there's this little hose that's glued into the side of the distributor cap in such a way that it doesn't get in the way of the spinning rotor. Now, I said ozone. Where does ozone come into play? Well, because you have a rotor, and that rotor is in contact with the coil tower. It's actually contacting inside here, but the tip of the rotor, as it spins around inside, it never actually touches the terminal. There's always a gap. And anytime you have an arc, which it has to do, you're going to have ozone. So you're building all kinds of ozone inside the distributor cap every time the coil discharges, goes through the rotor, and jumps across to the terminal. And then if you just run this to manifold vacuum, now you can draw that ozone out into the intake charge, and it'll improve combustion. Also, if you're drawing it out of the distributor cap, it's not in there oxidizing the metals in the distributor cap. And the distributor cap actually lasts longer. I had an 84 Dodge Charger, carbureted. I did the distributor cap mod on it. And stock, I was running right around 32, 33 miles per gallon. That's with a good tune-up. And then I did the distributor cap mod, and it took it up to about 37. I thought, well, if a little is good, a lot must be better. I found an online site that sells the driver unit and little coils that'll generate ozone. I mounted them in a box, and I plumbed it to the air cleaner. And now I was up to 44 miles per gallon. So the ozone will definitely improve fuel economy. Another technology that is an excellent combustion accelerant is the much poo-pooed onboard hydrogen generators. You have water in a reservoir with an electrolyte, and then you hook up electrical wires so that you create a voltage potential between the individual plates. And it takes the water and separates it into hydrogen and oxygen, and ionic radicals are the two. The OH radical being one of them. Hydrogen anions, oxygen cations, just radical stuff. And it's not the stable hydrogen and stable oxygen that really does the work, it's those radicals. What I found is that with the HHO, the flame front is faster. You're not making hydrogen and then burning hydrogen and expecting to get more out of the burning of the hydrogen than you put into making it. You're separating water, making hydrogen, so you can get more energy out of the fuel that you're burning. You put a little bit of energy into splitting the water, but the resultant gets you way more than that back in improved fuel economy. You see the relationship? It's well like a spark plug. How much energy does it take to fire the coil? How much do you get back from the engine? Well, technically, you can't even make enough energy out of that coil to run the engine. And as Mythbusters proved, you cannot make enough hydrogen out of this thing to run the engine. But that's not the goal.